Morning everyone, we'll get started. It is being recorded at the moment. So welcome everyone, I'm Dr Linda Colley, I'm GP and I'm Clinical Director for Portsmouth Place of the Hampshire and Isle of Wight ICB, and I co-chair this board. On behalf of the board, one of the first things I wanted to do today was to thank Jo York for her contribution over the years, as this is her second to last day. You've got one more day, haven't you, tomorrow with the ICB. She's obviously worked with the city for a long time, furthering the health and well-being of the city, and we just thank you for that. There'll be more official thank yous later. Yeah, just wanted to put that for the board. Limited public seating has been made available. However, the meeting is also being webcast to allow the public to attend remotely if they so wish. So for safety information, if the continuous fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the room and public gallery by the stairwells. Do not attempt to use the lifts. Please assemble in the turning circle at the end of King Henry, the first street past the park building. In order to comply with the Guildhall Trust Fire Marshal regulations, anyone who signed in at the Guildhall reception desk should sign out when leaving the building at the end of today's meeting. May I draw everyone's attention to the fact that this meeting will be live streamed. Everyone speaking via microphone will be on camera, including those making deputations. Members of the press and public are also permitted to record the meeting on the understanding that it neither disrupts the meeting nor records those stating explicitly that they do not wish to be recorded. Please can everyone use the microphones and remember to switch them off when they have finished speaking. So we have read the report, so presenters please just highlight any developments that have occurred since publication. So we're just going to go around the table to introduce everyone, starting to my left.
I'm Kelly Nash from the Strategy Unit at the City Council.
I'm Helen Atkinson, I'm the Director of Public Health for Portsmouth. Jo York, Director of Health and Care Portsmouth, ICB and Portsmouth City Council, last time.
Superintendent Mark Lewis, I'm District Commander for Portsmouth.
Good morning, Paul Riddell. I'm the Group Commander for Portsmouth, Hampton, East Hampshire from Hampshire and Isle of Wight Fire and Rescue Service.
Good morning everyone, Councillor Steve Pitt, Leader of the Portsmouth City Council.
Morning everyone, Natalie Brahma-Pearl, Chief Executive of Portsmouth City Council.
Morning, Jo Shankland, Vice Principal, City of Portsmouth College.
Morning everyone, Gemma Nichols, Chief Exec of Portsmouth Creates.
Morning, Jason Oakley. I'm the University of Portsmouth representative and I'm also representing Health Watch today as well.
Morning everybody, I'm Frances Sowell and I'm Chair of Portsmouth Education Partnership.
Good morning, Sarah Daly. I'm the Director of Children, Families and Education here in Portsmouth.
Morning, David Goosey, Chair of the Portsmouth Safeguarding Adults Board.
Lorna Reevely, Chief Officer of the Hive Portsmouth.
Morning everybody, Diane Sherlock, CEO of Age UK Portsmouth.
Anna Martin, Democratic Services.
Sam Graves, Community Safety Analyst for Portsmouth City Council.
Matt Gummerson, Assistant Director of Public Health, leading on Strategic Intelligence and Research.
Thank you. And we do have some apologies from today. So we've got Councillor Matthew Winnington, Councillor Susie Horton, Councillor Lewis Gosling, Councillor Graham Heaney, Sarah Beattie, Andy Biddle, Penny Emirate, Scott McKechnie, Alistair Snell and James Hill have all sent their apologies. Do we have any declarations of interest for today's meeting? No, thank you. So if we just look at the previous minutes, they were held on the 27th of September. So if we just go through for accuracy first of all, any comments? No. So are we happy to accept those minutes as an accurate reflection? Lovely. Was there any actions outstanding? There was only one I noticed, I just wanted to check had happened. We'd said that we were going to write about the adult boards formally. Did that go off, do we know?
I think it did. I would double check.
Can we just double check?
I'm pretty sure that I did.
Because we wanted to understand how the formaries worked, so they made sure Portsmouth had a...
I'm pretty sure it did.
Yeah, I think that was the only one I could spot. Thank you. Right, so we're actually going to change the agenda around a little bit. I hope you don't mind. So we're going to actually start with the Community Safety Strategic Assessment, and we're going to hand over for a little presentation for that.
Thank you, Chair. So I'll briefly introduce the item and then hand over to Sam, who's going to talk you through key findings from the strategic assessment. So as the report says, the Health and Wellbeing Board acts as the Community Safety Partnership for Portsmouth, and there's a statutory duty on CSPs to produce a strategic assessment and a plan that follows on from that, with an annual update. The next informal session of the Health and Wellbeing Board in January will very much focus on how we get from the strategic assessment to the community safety plan and all the associated pieces of work that connect into that. So we'll be looking at that in more detail, but what we're presenting here is the annual update to the strategic assessment. There'll be a full strategic assessment next year as part of the 3-year cycle, and the previous one from 2021 is available on the Safe Portsmouth website if any of you want to see it. This one will just go through kind of key crime trends, emerging issues, and it also includes a serious violence strategic needs assessment, so a new statutory duty that came in earlier this year. We've been working with colleagues across Hampshire and the Isle of Wight to produce both a Portsmouth level strategic needs assessment that then feeds into Hampshire and Isle of Wight wide piece of work that's being led by the OPCC and the Violence Reduction Unit. So that's the context. I'm going to hand over to Sam, who's going to talk you through what's in the slides. The slides are up behind me. I appreciate it's quite hard to see in here. There's nothing on the slides that Sam won't explain and that isn't covered in the draft strategic assessment that you've got a copy of in front of you. We can send the slides round. And just to note that the printed document in front of you, again, is just for your benefit. It's still a draft document. It's not a public document. Once we've gone through this process, you've approved it, and we've made some final changes around data that can't be published, we'll then publish it on the Safe Portsmouth website after that. Sam, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So just following on from what Matt said, really, this presentation is to give you an overview of the key findings from the strategic assessment update, which will include the serious violence SNA, and also there was a more detailed ASB chapter than we'd normally include in an update. And then I'll give a quick review of the priorities. So just to start off by saying that police recorded crime has been increasing over the last decade, but actually reduced by 2% since last year. Police data is a really important data set for us. It gives us a lot of detail about crime in the city, but there are some limitations to this data set. So one of the biggest ones is that not all crimes are reported to the police in the first place, and we don't know much about what's not reported to the police unless it's reported to other agencies. And also recording practices do change over time. So this means it's really important when doing the strategic assessment that I consider other data sources. So a big one of those is our local community safety survey, but also the National Crime Survey for England and Wales, and things like hospital attendances and admissions for violence. When I've considered all of the data, on balance, it's most likely that overall crime levels in Portsmouth have remained fairly stable over the last decade. However, some particular crime types may show different trends, so the strategic assessment also looks at individual crime types. So key findings are that most types of violent crime have reduced or remained broadly stable since last year, according to police data. But there has been an increase in police-recorded possession of a weapon offences, and this particular crime type is something that's really heavily impacted by police activity. So while it could reflect a genuine increase in weapons being carried in the community, it could also indicate a greater focus on searching suspects for weapons by the police. Domestic abuse continues to still be the largest known driver for violence, accounting for 40% of assaults in Portsmouth. Over the last decade, those of you who've read previous strategic assessments will know that there's been an increase in domestic abuse crimes reported to the police, and this now seems to be stabilising, but this is another crime type that's really heavily impacted by different things. So for this one, it's more about people being willing to report it to the police and the way that the police record it. And we've always thought that actually those factors have been having a much bigger impact on those previous increases that we saw. We also do a domestic abuse monitoring report, which looks at different aspects, including demand, calls for service, and the picture of domestic abuse in Portsmouth. And that identified there's still work to be done to challenge, support and hold domestic abuse perpetrators to account. So the number of perpetrators charged with offences and successful court outcomes for domestic abuse offences is still quite low. There have been some positive outcomes for some standard risk offenders who accept responsibility for their actions, but the data shows that this is still only a small proportion of people who are using abusive or unhealthy behaviours and completing interventions. The number of young people at risk of criminal exploitation has increased since last year, and this is likely to be partially due to better awareness and also better referral pathways. But it is also thought by I think it was a MASH team that provided the data, that it's also likely to be a small genuine increase linked to exploitation of young people by local drug networks. Police data has also shown an increase in thefts from and of a vehicle, and conversely a reduction in shoplifting offences. But when we've looked at other data sources, that's actually suggested that shoplifting has increased, but offences were not being reported to the police. I do believe that there's been a bit of work done to try and tackle that, because it's hard to evidence increases in crimes if they're not reported. Moving on to the serious violence SNA that Matt talked about briefly. So there's now this new serious violence duty on responsible authorities, just to ensure that relevant services do work together to prevent and reduce serious violence. So the responsible authorities include local authorities, the police, probation, youth offending services, integrated care systems and fire service. Duty also requires us to share information and produce an SNA and prepare and implement a serious violence strategy. The SNA that we produced this year was a HIPS-wide collaborative process, so HIPS being Hampshire, Isle of Wight, Portsmouth and Southampton, whereby upper-tier local authorities have worked together to produce different sections of the SNA, and a police VRU analyst produced a problem profile based on police data, but this was done very much in consultation with local authority analysts, and in fact actually came and co-located with me while this was being done, so that we would have a lot more influence over how the data was cleaned and analysed. SNAs were produced for all 14 districts in the HIPS area, and this is an unusual way of doing it. Normally there's just a Hampshire-wide document with just a few notes about where peak areas might be. It was done this way so that we could ensure that all districts had local level data highlighting their issues rather than the top-down document that we normally get. And the VRU analyst is now using these 14 district SNAs to produce an overarching HIPS SNA. We've made the decision to include this SNA within the strategic assessment, so it's all in one document, and it can be read in the context of the other crime and ASB trends in the area, and also be used to feed into community safety priorities. So last year, in 2022-23, there were just over 1,000 serious violence offences, which is a rate of about 5 per 1,000. It's the second highest rate in comparison with the other HIPS at CSPs, but is slightly lower than Southampton. It's important to note that what serious violence actually is, and a large proportion of these are possession of a weapon offences, followed by some of the more serious violence with injury offences, often sort of known as sort of wounding, GBH and above, and robbery of personal property. It does include small numbers of homicide where that occurs, and also violent disorder offences as well. Serious violence levels have been similar to last year, but they are higher than pre-COVID levels, and when I've looked into that, the increase has been driven by increases in possession of a weapon offences and robbery. So, what do we know about serious violence? It's concentrated in the city centre and nearby neighbourhoods. There are no clear seasonal trends over 5 years that we looked at, but there are high levels on Fridays through to Sundays and in the evenings, suggesting that nighttime economy could be a significant driver, and particularly because about 60% are known to have occurred in public spaces. Where we recorded the victim and suspect relationship, the most common relationship was strangers, followed by victimless crimes. 18% were between acquaintances and 15% were domestic in nature, so ex-partners, partners or family. And it sounds unusual to say serious violence, 29% were victimless, but victimless crimes are actually commonly recorded for possession of a weapon offences, so that is why that is the case. We also looked at factors that are associated with the increased likelihood of violence, either being a victim or a perpetrator. And Portsmouth compared fairly poorly with the Hampshire average, but also the England average for many of these, including family, accommodation, employment, income, education, young people at risk, mental health and substance use domains. Moving on to antisocial behaviour. So we know there's been a substantial and sustained reduction in antisocial behaviour reported to the police over the last decade. And while some other services have seen an increase in reports of ASB, there's still quite a large shortfall in the number of ASB incidents reported to local agencies in general. And that really isn't consistent with what we've been hearing from residents who are still reporting high levels of ASB. So we've also looked at data from the last community safety survey that we do in Portsmouth in 2022. And that has shown that the levels of ASB really have remained fairly stable since 2014. We feel it's really important that residents are encouraged to report ASB, but to the correct agencies, so we have evidence of issues and are able to tackle those effectively. Not tackling them could affect confidence in the police and agencies dealing with the issues. The next slide really is a bit of a response to some comments that were made at this meeting last time when I presented the findings of the previous community safety survey. So I thought it would be good to feed back a bit. We've been carrying out the community safety survey since 1997, although there's been changes to some of the questions and also some of the ways that they've been asked. One of the questions, though, that we've been consistently asking since 2001 asks residents about where they feel unsafe or where they avoid because of fear of crime. And this slide that I've put up there is not very clear, but it is, I'm not quite sure what page it's on in the document that you've got, but it is actually in that, in the, I've really got a hand. 67, okay. You might find it easier to look at that. Basically, the areas are ranked. There's actually more areas than this. There's probably about 25. This is a top 10, ranked from 1, which is the area where most residents said they felt unsafe, and 10 is the least. Somerstown and Buckland have consistently remained areas that people commonly feel unsafe or avoid, while other areas have shown improvement or deteriorated over time. Now, Somerstown and Buckland, actually the main reason that people sort of cite is actually a bad reputation, and that's their words. So having a look at some of the areas that have improved or deteriorated over time in the ranking system, Portsea has experienced a massive regeneration project resulting in Gunwall Quays, and that has definitely led people to rate the area as being safer. But conversely, when Cascades Shopping Centre was refurbished, this didn't really have a lasting impact on ASB, and we can see now that after a decade it started creeping up to a lower ranking, and now ranks about 3rd or 4th most unsafe place over the last few years. A really interesting one to note is Paulsgrove, actually, because that also ranked as, you know, an area where people felt unsafe because of a bad reputation in the early 200s. And improvements were seen from about 2009 onwards. And this was thought to be due to quite a lot of work in the area, starting particularly with positive family futures, and also the inclusion of dispersal zones in the area. So it could be somewhere where we could look at to see whether things could be you know, translated into work done in Somerstown or Buckland. And on the topic of the community safety survey, I'm planning that right now, and the fieldwork should take place in February and March next year. I'm in the process of you know, contacting different locations. The report for the previous surveys is also on the community safety partnership Safe Portsmouth Partnership website, so you can see the previous reports, and there is actually an appendix that lists the locations that we did before. It's likely to be very similar again this time, but I'm always willing to take suggestions of areas where people think it would be good to do surveys, in particular looking for steady and quite high footfall areas, really, to sort of maximise responses. And just for those of you who haven't come across the community safety survey before, we do usually talk to about 1,000 residents face to face, so the findings are really important to us. So, but what I will do is talk to comms about getting out some communications. We'll also put the dates of the sessions on the Safe Portsmouth Partnership website and probably a bit on social media as well. I think we did Facebook last time. And finally, just checking the priorities. There's actually a bit of a process that we do. Not only do we actually sort of, there's all the stuff that's included in the strategic assessment, but we also have something called the matrix, where it's a bit of a scoring system where we look at the volume, we look at trends, we look at whether something's like to be underreported or disproportionately affecting a particular group of people. Also things like whether something's like to be substance misuse related. This scoring process and the matrix is found in one of the appendix for the strategic assessment. And after doing this process for 2022-23, we recommend that the priorities remain unchanged, and the priorities they're up on the screen, so I wasn't necessarily going to read them out. But yeah, no, we're recommending they remain the same. Okay, so as Matt said, you can find links to the previous strategic assessments on the Safer Portsmouth Partnership website. And once this update that you've seen has been approved and any final reductions made, we'll be putting the public version on the website, which can be shared with anyone who wants to read it and used to sort of evidence any work that you do. And I'm always happy if anyone wants any clarifications for you to email me, and I think my email address, the CS Researchers inbox, is a place to sort of contact me. And yeah, if there's any questions.
Thank you. I'm sure you'd agree, a very thorough report and quite a lot of interesting facts in there that we can use. Any questions or comments? David?
I appreciate this might not have been part of your research in this particular field, but I just wonder if there is any indication that you have about what are the causes of the vulnerabilities that lead people to victimhood.
It's linked into a lot of the stuff that the Health and Wellbeing Board are doing. I don't think anyone's got an actual answer. There's a lot of evidence where people have found associations with various things, and I have actually got quite detailed sort of spreadsheet of all the different studies for factors that have been found to be linked to serious violence, because I did that as part of the serious violence work. But a lot of it, again, is sort of around engagement in education, about, ACEs and family stability, about poverty plus, but it's a really complex situation because, like, for example, you're more likely to find higher levels of serious violence in areas where there is high deprivation, but not all areas of high deprivation will have high levels of serious violence. So there's obviously a lot more going on there, if that's helpful.
Thank you.
Anything else? Oh,
Yeah, thank you. Firstly, Sam, really good report, thank you. I know we've discussed it as well, and just really pass on my compliments for what you've done in relation to it. And I think, picking up David's point there, I think it's when you read the strategic needs assessment alongside this, that's where you sort of get that sort of commonality and the interdependencies, and I think hopefully that's some of the work that we'll pick up in the development day around how they sort of, those elements drive it, because I think what the strategic needs assessment really highlights for me is that, clearly, and we've said this for many years, this is not just about policing, and it's, there's so many other factors at play here, and when you look at the poverty, education, attainment, and so on and so forth. So I think bringing, so really, I'm really pleased that we're doing a development day in relation to bring this together, because I think the report says one thing. The report is really good for bringing out some of the highlights. But actually, we need to look at the the strategic needs assessment, which actually then starts to sort of get into that detail that you're talking about. Just some other bits, just if I can just, I think, yes, well, you know, without prejudging what next year's assessment will say, I'm absolutely convinced that the things like the thefts from shops will increase significantly. And as much as that has gone down, I think that is, and I think Sam picked up in the report and it's covered in there, the figures might say one thing, but actually what we're being told, what we feel, is something completely different. I would wholeheartedly agree with that, and I think some of the work that's been going on probably this year will actually sort of reflect that in next year's statistics as well. Yes, the violence within the home is still a significant matter. That's sort of acquaintance-linked violence, domestic abuse is something it's a real difficult nut to crack, and it always has been, and I think that is going to be obviously key for us as much as the stranger, the nighttime economy element of this. You know, there is work that's going on. We've got the Violent Crime Task Force under the OPCC, which is getting into some of this as well, making sure that they're linked in because they're looking at some of that longer-term problem-solving part of this as well. Because I think that what they're doing is actually trying to sort of layer off some of those causes and actually see what can be done in partnership as well. And I think that's probably all I'll sort of cover on that report until we get into development day. But thank you, and thank you very much, Sam.
Yes, Councillor Pitt.
Thanks very much. I just want to echo Mark's comments a little bit and some of the things that Sam was picking up on around the shoplifting issue, because I think the level of reporting from everything I've seen is way, way, way lower than the actual incidents. We had a recent meeting with which Mark's colleagues were also present at, with the retailers and market stall holders in Commercial Road, where there was a huge amount of anxiety, and it's quite clear that they are just not reporting. Lauren Taylor and I have been liaising with the Albert Road Traders Association, and they are saying that crime is being reported, yet the figures say that it's not. And I've only got to check through their daily messages to us to see that there are multiple incidents taking place on a daily basis, and yet I believe in October the number of reported incidents were about 8. So I just wonder why, with that going on, and it's shoplifting's links to other crime, there's a lot of evidence that there's shoplifting to order going on, that it's supporting other addiction and other issues. Why are we not proposing to add that into the priorities? I think Mark wants to add something.
Sorry. Why it's not reflected in the priorities is because we go through a specific matrix where we look at all the crime types together and we rank them in terms of volume, but also harm to people, like physical harm and emotional. There's a whole, if you actually look at the appendix, it sets out about the volume that we've got to see increased, whether it's been reported or not, things like that. So when we're comparing that with the impact of serious violence and how disproportionately that affects people and how that can be hidden crime and the physical impact as well as emotional impact, it should be quite straightforward.
I do understand that, but I don't think we're picking up on the level of anxiety that's out there. Shopkeepers are terrified to go to work. Retailers are saying, you know, they can't get their staff to work now unless they're wearing body cams. This is really serious, and it is having a major impact on a huge number of people. And if our statistics are not picking that up, I think we need to do a targeted piece of work to really fully understand the impact this is having.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Councillor Pitt. And I think we have the other bit that we didn't mention is we have a research and analysis programme alongside the strategic assessment. So in the document we identify those areas where we think we need to know more about an issue, and I think this should be probably based on what you're saying and based on what Mark was saying, something that we kind of bring to the top of that list to, as you say, do that piece of work to understand the issue more, because if it is an issue that's clearly causing a lot of concern but doesn't show up in the current statistics, we need to get that data and that intelligence so that we can then work with colleagues to put in place the right response.
Thank you. Just to sort of deal with the report and things, there will be, without doubt, a reflected increase in reported crime for next year, because and you know, and I think that's a good thing that the figures have gone up, because I think the confidence is going up. This report that will also be alongside increased of people being brought to justice. I know this assessment is for the last year, and I'm talking now about the current year stats, so I'm very conscious not to conflate the two. But you know, I think it is it's an important point. The figures will go up for next year's assessment, but also those brought to justice will go up. I mean, I'm conscious this is about community safety. There is an element, it is an element of community safety. It's around people's feeling around how safe they feel. It's not just about the violent element of it. So I think it is, and it's around that general feeling of the city as well. So it's something we are supportive of, and I think, Councillor Pitt, you're fully aware that we are. It certainly is a priority for us as well, and where we can seek opportunities to tell the public around some of what's been going on, then we are certainly exploring those. But you know, I think, and Sam and I have discussed this, the figures from last year, I think, reflect a moment in time. But that's not to sort of dismiss it. I think it's probably just sort of says, explain those figures, and we recognise where we are now, and I think we are in an improving position, but that's not to say that we have solved it, and it's not to say that there's not work to be done. And I would absolutely welcome if there was some more work, because it's not just about theft from shop, it will be linked to whether it be, you know, without getting into the politics of this, whether it's cost of living, whether it's other aspects of it, whether it's organised criminality as well. I think it is understanding some of those elements to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Jo?
Yeah, thank you. Again, really good, really helpful report. I just wanted to pick up on some of the stats on page 46 around the admissions to hospital for substance misuse and alcohol services. And I think the alcohol-related admissions are sort of a bit lower than elsewhere, which hopefully is good down to the strong alcohol prevention service that we've got. But the the substance misuse admissions seem significantly lower, but the deaths higher. So I just wondered if there was a coding issue, perhaps, and maybe there's work we need to be doing with the hospital to look at better and see if we're reporting it correctly, and also around the physical injury and what impact that might be having just in terms of people's longer term health, because it's harder to track, isn't it? But I think it's worth understanding these violent crimes will have an ongoing impact to the health and care system as well, potentially, as well as people's lives.
Yeah, I was just going to say, on page 46, actually, this particular measure is for 15 to 24-year-olds for substance misuse, and the drug-related deaths will be a very different cohort. So that's why I would expect to see that. But also, there's also a monitoring report that goes to Combating Drugs Partnership, which focuses a lot more on the measures around substance misuse in the city, and we'll go into it a lot more detail. But yeah, I mean, with the coding issues, there are certain measures, especially like the emergency department data, where we know that when people come in, it's not as robust as perhaps the admission data, because people are just recording what they're seeing. They haven't had time to do all the tests and do, you know, everything straight away. So there are limitations, for example, with the violence data that you get from the emergency departments. Yeah, we're aware of that.
Helen?
Just worth noting, and Sam does the work for the Combating Drugs Partnership Board as well, that we are coming back with reports to the next Health and Wellbeing Board, which will be helpful. But we can certainly take that back. But it's worth noting that we have had a significant uplift in government funding for substance misuse, including alcohol recently, which has gone into treatment services. So we'll be updating on that at the next meeting, and no doubt you might be back with us there, Sam.
Thank you. So thank you once again for the report. So we've been asked to basically accept that assessment so that we can use it in our evidence base for our decision making. Are we happy to do that? Lovely. Thank you. So if it's okay now, we'll go to the Portsmouth Safeguarding Adults Board annual report. David.
Thank you. I think it's fortunate that I'm able to present to you this morning the Portsmouth Safeguarding Adult Board annual report alongside details of the reviews of the deaths of 3 adults in the city. And I say it's fortunate because I think the reviews into the deaths of those 3 adults illustrate a number of issues in respect of the priorities for the board and some of the challenges that they've faced. I won't dwell on the details of the report. I think it's all there for you to see. There's been some progress this year, but as our last meeting testified, there is also a shortage of resource for the board, and so there are limitations in respect of what it can achieve. I think the deaths of the three people, Kim, Ronnie and Paul, illustrate a series of very tragic circumstances. And the figures that we've just been looking at, in a sense, here are some of the outcomes of some of those indicators. These three people, in a sense, fell through the net, and the net just wasn't good enough to capture and hold on to their circumstances. And it does point, I think, to the need for a continued and much more rigorous approach to dealing with risk assessments in respect of complex adults, like these three people were. I think it's also important to point out the impact of stigma on these three adults. I think they often held off from seeking assistance because of what I think they thought was the reaction that they would get from people. And indeed, when you look at some of their histories, they don't command sympathy easily. And I think there is also a key issue really around what is the city's approach to housing people in these types of circumstances, and I don't doubt that the challenges around that are huge. I think the only other thing I wanted to mention, I think, is reference to the last development day when we were looking at the use of the liberated model. And I really do think, or at least in my imagination, I can see how, for these three people, an adult with a trusting relationship to them may have made an enormous difference to the way in which they could have taken up the help that was on offer to them. And so I'm really hopeful that if that can become something of a reality in the city, we may see fewer of these types of deaths. And I should point out, of course, that in the year in which the annual report was published, or is concerning, we did have a thematic review into the deaths of 10 adults. And here we've got another 3 in fairly similar circumstances. And so without intervention, we're likely to see this process carrying on.
Thank you. Helen. Thank you, David. And you just mentioned there our last informal meeting of the Health and Wellbeing Board, so many of the people here were there, which we will be bringing some proposals back to the next meeting of the Health and Wellbeing Board. But I think you make a really important point, which was really clear in all of our discussions, because we were talking about, we have so many different names, don't we, and different organisations, but we are talking about our most vulnerable complex adults whose behaviour, as you say, doesn't always necessarily support them having those relationships with services. But I think what was really clear is that we were all, even though a lot of work is already in place in terms of how we try to support these really vulnerable adults, whether it's our homeless population, our substance misusers, those with mental health, and often actually what we talk about is people have all 3 of those, but also people who have been through the justice system. So that will come back with some proposals, and there's already some meetings started to look at scoping that work. But Kelly has given me some notes, so I'll just, but it's important, so I don't forget, but it is important because ultimately where we are trying to place this work, because it's about all of us coming from all of our different organisations, voluntary sector, the NHS, council, police, all of organisations, focusing perhaps differently on this group of people, because they are falling between, they're basically falling between all of our different service nets, and therefore we had the tragic death. But it's really focusing therefore on our, what we're calling our positive relationships priority in health and wellbeing. Well, because if we look at all our strategies, all of the things we're doing that will help support this, but it's actually, that's where we want to put this work, because it's clear from what you've said that actually if they had positive relationships in both their communities, but also in services, it would have made a difference. And that's why we want to ensure that that rather than rushing into this piece of work, that we really scope it well and actually ensure that we're all involved. And I hope it felt like I think it felt like a really good, it was one of our best informal sessions, I think, that we've had, because it did feel that everybody had everybody felt it affected what they deliver. So we've really got to make sure that this is a proper partnership approach to the outcomes, because what we've done so far, even though there's been a huge amount of passion and wanting to make a difference, still we are finding that people are falling through this net. So I think you make a really important point, so thanks, David.
I'm relatively new to my role, but I'm on the board for the Portsmouth Safeguarding Children Partnership as the DSL, but I'm not on the adult board, and education doesn't seem to be represented. We obviously do training and education of a significant number of adults that are on our radar, and I just think that we're talking about people falling through the gaps. I think a gap may be that the college isn't part of those discussions as well. So I'd just like to put forward, I'm happy to volunteer.
I shall ensure you get an invitation.
Any other comments or questions? I mean, thank you for the report. The case studies really do make it, don't they? It really brings it to life why we need to improve what's going on. And yeah, so thank you, really useful. So we've been asked to accept that report for today. Now, we were due to have the Safeguarding Children's Partnership annual report to next item, but unfortunately they can't make today, the presenter can't make, and it is such an important thing that we do want it done properly, so we're going to postpone that till the next session, if that's okay.
I'll just come in. I could do that as the Director of Children's Services, but I know that Scott, as the new board chair, was very keen to come and talk to the work of the board, so we did agree last night that he would come at the next meeting, so hopefully that is an agreement for the board.
Yeah, and I think that's appropriate. If you spent a lot of time working on it, it would be nice to meet him and have that presented. So we'll move on to Health and Wellbeing Strategy Tackling Poverty, which I believe is Mark Sage. Hi there, Mark.
Thanks everybody. So my name's Mark Sage. I'm the City Council's Tackling Poverty Coordinator, and I am here to present an update on the health and wellbeing strategy priority area of tackling poverty. So since the last update to the board, which was in September last year, there have been significant developments around, first of all, the impact of cost of living pressures with continuing high inflation, but changes over time as to the biggest factors for households, particularly around energy, fuel, food and housing costs. Also, there's been a lot of work around the resources and services that have been put in place to respond to that. And importantly, the work led by the Public Health Intelligence Team, which was summarised in the Public Health Annual Report, to bring together the data and evidence on the extent and impact of poverty and cost of living pressures in Portsmouth. So we've also over the last year had 2 development sessions for Health and Wellbeing Board members outside of the main board meeting to further consider how we work together in partnership on this agenda. So the main partnership group overseeing and developing action to tackle poverty is the Tackling Poverty Steering Group, which is a subgroup of the Health and Wellbeing Board, and that is meeting tomorrow to look at the learning from the needs assessment provided by the Public Health Annual Report, and to use that as a basis for refreshing the work of the partnership and developing an updated action plan on tackling poverty. The report talks a bit about some of the resources that have been put in place to respond to the cost of living pressures and support people in poverty. And looking forward, there is a significant risk to funding to make the board aware of. The report notes that last week was the autumn budget statement, and we were hoping for confirmation from the Treasury in that statement that the funding provided to local authorities under the Household Support Fund delivered by the Department of Work and Pensions would continue into 2024-25. Unfortunately, in the autumn budget statement, the only reference to Household Support Fund is to the current round of funding, which ends on the 31st of March 2024. And the guidance around that is very clear that it can only be used within the current financial year. So that means that as we stand, there's no certainty on Household Support Fund funding coming through to any local authorities in 2024-25. I would say that's possibly not the final answer. We have in the past, on various rounds of Household Support Fund and the COVID support grants that came before Household Support Fund, we have had very late notice from government that a decision had been made and something would be put in place. But at the present time, there is no certainty that there will be that funding, and that funding is providing it's around £3.8 million a year in Portsmouth, and it's providing significant financial support and other forms of support to people in Portsmouth, and funding a number of temporary posts that help to deliver that support. So I think it's really important kind of risk to raise with the board to be aware of. And we will obviously keep looking, and I think we'll be looking at what we can do to lobby around that and to make sure that the government and DWP are fully aware of what the impact of this will be in local areas. But there is significant risk there. So as I say, obviously the next steps really is going into the Tackling Poverty Steering Group is looking at delivery over coming months, and that will also start to look at how we work around the resources that we have available. So the report's really intended to give an update on that. I had hoped to be able to give more of a positive update on looking forward with being able to plan for next year, and unfortunately that's not the position that we're in at the moment. So really happy to take any questions on any of that or anything that's in the report. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. Any comments or questions? Yeah, Councillor Pitt.
Yes, thanks. Mark and I have been exchanging emails this morning on this, and I always admire Mark's never-ending optimism, but I'm really pessimistic about this because I think they had a massive opportunity in the autumn statement to say some big things about continuing to support people who were suffering hardship, and they didn't. So I am really worried, and I've raised it today at the highest levels of the LGA. I've already had a response this morning to say that they've picked up on it and they are working on it, and we're expecting a joint approach across all councils to lobby government to effectively change their mind, because the indication we have at the moment is the funding will not be there, and on top of everything else that's going on, losing this 3.8 million will be catastrophic.
Absolutely. Helen.
Yeah, I'm sure we will, because I know Councillor Pitts just said we will be definitely using the opportunity to raise our concerns, but I also want to, I suppose, broaden it to everybody's business. I think everybody gets that here, but the reality is we've had now, well, we're about to go into 2024, we've had 4 years of both the impact of COVID initially, and then obviously the cost of living and the huge increase in fuel prices, food, etc. That hasn't gone away, and I think we think that the impact from COVID has gone away. It hasn't, and I think recognise still that the impact of cost of living hasn't gone away, and it will continue into next year and probably actually future years. So it does have a direct impact. So as well as obviously all of the work that Mark's talking about through the steering group, which is a all-partner steering group, so everybody is involved, we will continue to see the impact that we've seen because of this, both obviously, Mark would say, on the police, but also in the NHS, because we've already seen huge significant pressures in the NHS. So I think it's worth us considering that when we think about the impact this is going to have, because we've done a huge amount of work to support people, our most vulnerable residents who are, and also looking obviously at our colleagues in Age Concerned, Portsmouth and the Hive. We've done together a huge amount of work that has slightly, because we have worked really hard, but it has slightly mitigated, but we're still seeing huge impacts. We can see from the strategic assessment, we can see in what's happening every single day in GP services, in community pharmacy services. We've had recent summits on both of those in the acute trust. So I just think it's really important that we recognise the real impact this can have on our whole population. Sorry, I know that you all know that, but I feel it's important to state it.
Thank you, Mark. So we've been asked to accept that report, and obviously the outline actions are there. We'll obviously have you back when we know about next year's amounts then, I suppose, see what we're doing about it there. Thank you. Over to the education attainment update.
Okay, good morning. It's Mike Stoneman, Deputy Director for Education. I'm going to run through a set of slides which are in your packs, a fairly quick canter through, although I'll give a bit of context before I start that. Happy to take any questions either during the course of the presentation or afterwards. Bit of context. I mean, what I'm going to go through at the moment are quite a sobering set of results, if I'm being brutally honest, and disappointing in some cases. Through Key Stage 1 through to Key Stage 4. Bit of background around this. So, as some of you are aware, we've got an interesting education landscape in Portsmouth. The majority of our schools now are part of a multi-academy trust. We have 14 MATs in the city. They are responsible for standards and school improvement. Having said that, we recognise that there are a variety of factors impacting on pupils' attainment and progress, and we therefore have a strong Portsmouth Education Partnership in place with a variety of key partners around that table, all pulling together to try and improve the situation in Portsmouth. It has to be a collective effort. There are so many external factors that impact on attainment. It can't be otherwise. Worth also just noting that on a pleasing note, in the last few months, we've had a series of Ofsted inspections, and whilst some of those results are not yet published, they're all going in the right direction again. We had a bit of a dip early in the year and the year before, but things are now improving, and that's good to see. And we're probably going to get back to something which we call the Portsmouth paradox, whereby we've got the majority of our schools good or outstanding, according to Ofsted, yet in terms of attainment and progress, we're in the sort of bottom 10% of most local authorities across the country. So it's an interesting conundrum for us, but you know, one just to note. We're also been identified as a priority education investment area. We're one of 24 new areas across the country. Whilst that puts the spotlight on us in terms of how are we going to raise attainment, it does carry with it some increased resources. So we were given a grant of 1.8 million. We've got a delivery plan in place, which is now being implemented across 4 priorities: literacy, maths, school attendance, and then also a focus on some of our underperforming groups, cohorts of children, and putting in some strong continuous professional development for staff involved in supporting those groups of children. So that's underway, really good sign up, and going well actually in terms of the implementation, but we know we've got a long journey ahead of us. So that's a bit of context. In terms of the slides, hopefully you've got colour versions. I've got a black and white version in front of me, but if you've got a black and white version, then just to let you know, what you'll be seeing are sort of 3 lines. The blue one is Portsmouth, which tends to be at the bottom pretty consistently. Then you've got the green line, which is our statistical neighbours, 10 stat neighbours that we use, and that's the average for those neighbours. And then the top line is the red line, which is the England national average. So that's just to give you a bit of context there. I'm not going to go through every slide because that could take some time, so I will just give some highlights. Now, the first one to look at, and by the way, it starts off quite positively and then starts to, as we go down the key stages, become a little bit more negative. So I'm going to start off with a real positive. So the Year 1 phonics check that we do with all our schools, this is a national measure. We have made a significant improvement this year, so an 8 percentage point increase. And that has closed the gap on both our stat neighbours average and our national average. And we're getting back to somewhere near where we were pre-pandemic. And by the way, when we're making comparisons, the most pertinent comparison to make is with the figure in 2019, because of the impact on the pandemic, because we weren't actually doing any assessment and testing during the course of the pandemic. And then last year, difficult to make real comparisons, but I'll explain a bit more about that later. So yeah, look at the 2019 results when you're thinking about a comparison. So that's a positive start, and phonics is really important. It's the foundation for our kids and for literacy and reading, so really good to see that improvement. At Key Stage 1, we have a number of measures across reading, writing and maths. I've given you here the expected standard in those areas, and what you'll see is a slight improvement from last year, which is encouraging, that's positive, but also what you need to note is that the gap between ourselves and national has pretty much stayed the same for all three measures. So what we were hoping to see is a narrowing of that gap. That's the objective, and we haven't really seen that yet. So that's the most important point, I think, to make from the Key Stage 1 results. Then we go into Key Stage 2, so end of Key Stage 2. Again, I've given you the expected standard here. And we start off with a combined measure, which is looking at both reading, writing and maths. And you can see there that there has been no real change since last year, and we're still some way off the figures that we had back in 2019. Now, the only salvation we've got there is that that's pretty much the same across the country. There has been no change, so that gap remains as it was. But if we just drill down a bit and we look at the three measures that make up that combined standard, so starting with reading, this is probably the most disappointing result because we had made really steady progress around reading, particularly over the last year or so, and the year before, sorry. So we saw a significant drop. Now that drop was replicated across the country. You might have heard in the press a lot of disgruntled feelings about how tough that particular test was, and we saw that across the country, but the drop we saw in Portsmouth was more significant than other areas, so that gap has widened, which is disappointing given the amount of effort we've put into reading. We are expecting to see a significant upturn in 24, but obviously we don't have yet those results, but that's what we're expecting. Writing, we saw an increase, a small increase, but as you can see, that increase was similar in other areas, so that gap has remained pretty much the same. For maths, again, very small increase, and again, small increases across the stat neighbours and our national average. So again, that gap remains the same. So a similar sort of story to Key Stage 1, some increases, yep, that's positive, a decrease in reading, which obviously was disappointing, but that gap between ourselves and national is stubbornly remaining the same. We haven't narrowed it. We go on to Key Stage 4, and this is probably more of a depressing picture because here, and it's really worth just comparing with 2019, you may be aware that in 2022 there was a degree of latitude and a fairly generous set of marks. So we don't really look too much at 22. We really can see, have we got back to where we were in 2019? And what you'll see across all these measures, whether it's English and maths, whether it's standard pass, strong passes, you'll see that we've dipped, as has across the country, but we have not got back to those levels that we were in 2019, whereas nationally they've pretty much got back to where they were in 2019. So that gap has significantly narrowed. And if you look at other measures like Attainment 8 and Progress 8, again, significant drops there and not getting back to where we were in 2019. So that gap has widened. So that is probably the most concerning set of results from Key Stage 4 across our 10 secondary schools. The majority of those schools are with multi-academy trusts, and we've been talking individually with all those schools to see where they're at. I think probably the biggest factor has been the tail of the pandemic, and also now school attendance, which is why it's one of our top priorities. School attendance at secondary level is just not good enough. I mean, that's the case across the country, but particularly acute in Portsmouth, and particularly in terms of persistent absence, so missing 10% or more sessions at school, and indeed our severely absent numbers, those missing more than 50%, those figures have gone up too. It's much smaller numbers, but it's a worrying sign. So, which is why collectively we're doing a lot around attendance and why it's one of our key priorities under the priority education investment area. So I will stop there. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you for that. And I think with the attendance, certainly as a GP, I'm seeing a lot more of the senior school age with anxiety, mental health problems, and the parents are saying we can't get them to school, and so it's how we work collectively around that, isn't it, to help them stay in education as much as they possibly can. Any comments or questions? Oh yeah, sorry, Matt.
Mike, can I just check on you mentioned the attendance as being a key driver. What kind of percentage of pupils are missing 10% of session? What's that look like?
Yeah, well, just in terms of overall absence, we're just starting with that. So overall absence is around about sort of 91, 92%, and that's a real concern. And then in terms of those kids that are missing, 10% of sessions, we've got a fairly big chunk of kids, 20% or more, who are missing that sort of number of sessions. And clearly that is a really worrying figure for us. And then in terms of severely absent, I can't give the percentage, but in terms of the global figure numbers, we're looking at sort of 600 pupils who are missing 50%. Sorry, 50%. So that's really worrying. Yeah.
So, and I don't want to downplay attendance at all in any way, because clearly it's vitally important. But looking at those Key Stage 4, that's 48%, nearly half of pupils that left school without a 4 or above in English and maths.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
I don't know the local figures, but I know the national figures are that only 1 in 5 of them will ever pass English and maths through the additional work at college. So that's 40% of our pupils that are leaving school without the minimum level of qualifications that are viewed as acceptable for any kind of job. So just to kind of reiterate the point that in terms of the Health and Wellbeing Board focus on this as a priority, as a cause of the cause, that is a huge proportion of our population that are starting life without the qualifications to get work that will lead to them having income, that would lead to cost of living crisis, would lead to health issues, health literacy, all of those things. I'm sorry, I know I'm telling you stuff that you're aware of, but just to kind of make this is why this is not a small proportion of our population. This is nearly half of our children.
I was just going to support Mike in terms of the college has seen a significant increase, and I mean significant increase of students coming to us now that would have done level 2 or level 3 qualifications. We've had a massive spike in students coming in to do entry level and level 1 because of the maths and English. It's a real issue. The attendance is an issue. If it's in schools, as it is, it's then come through to the college. We've seen a massive drop in our attendance for, we know that COVID, etc., but this year we are seeing it as a significant issue. We are working closely with Amanda at the council to support the Every Day Counts initiative. So we're providing role models for students at those schools where there is the persistent attendance issues, but we are experiencing it as well as a FE college. So we are putting together a strategy that will dovetail into the everyday matters as well.
Yeah, just to mention that because we're relaunching the school attendance campaign. We had something Miss School Miss Out pre-pandemic. We're now launching a new campaign. I think it's Every Day Counts, yeah, and that will be launched in January. And we've got everybody right behind that new campaign, and we've been working with parents in particular to make sure that this campaign hits that area. So yeah, hopefully that will make some difference, but it's just part of an overall strategy.
I think it's also important to start looking forward at those children who are just entering our school system and our education system, thinking about that early years offer in the city, and how we better prepare parents and those children for when they enter school. What we're currently seeing is kind of significant concern, again, around the impact of the pandemic, around the impact of the mental health kind of concerns for adults, and what that therefore means for those children coming into early years providers and into reception is parents being quite surprised when they see that their children are not as kind of forward in terms of development as other children, and not really appreciating where their child should be at that stage. So I think for us, whilst we look at school, we look at education, we look at the strategies we have in place there, and they are robust, the other focus for us, which is fortunate we have this as a key strategy for the ICB as well, is that first 1,001 days. And there's a really coherent plan in place to start really focusing on those parents, on those children at the earliest opportunity, so that we are changing their futures. Because we have to do something at that point, or we're just building a bigger problem.
Yeah. Thank you. Any other comments? Oh, Kelly?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to observe, obviously, that the pandemic impact is clearly significant, and actually when we're talking about comparing with 2019, actually the numbers are still below 2017 on a number of the graphs, aren't they, which suggests that sort of that loss of progress in terms of what we've been trying to achieve as a system is really significant and will take huge amounts of time to build back from. Just observing that the gap between sort of where we were and where we are now seems to be much bigger in Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 4 than Key Stage 2, which, and I just wonder if there are any lessons we can take around kind of, and I'm sure you're right about the early years impact of some of that, but whether there was sort of any lessons we can take about what was clearly maybe more resilience within that Key Stage 2 phase around kind of maintaining where they were and getting back to where they were than the others, and whether there's anything we can take from that into sort of some of the other phases.
Yeah, I mean, a piece of work we're doing at the moment is looking at that transition between Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3. So we're working on a sort of a protocol to make sure that we've really got that cracked, because what we're seeing is, you know, kids that are because the way the primary school works, they put a lot of support around, wraparound support around some of those children, particularly our most vulnerable, and that just about keeps them on track. They then hit secondary and it starts to fall apart. And there are a variety of reasons for that. But what we're trying to do with our secondary schools and with our primary schools is to improve that collaboration, that transition, to make sure that those children are clearly identified and those that need a bit of additional support, and potentially, in some cases, for the primary teachers to come across and provide a bit of support in that first term. Because if you start to lose them in year 7 and you start to have impact on attendance and all the anxiety that might go with that, then it really is a tough job to reel that back in. So that transition is critical, and we're working on that. Yeah.
I don't know if it's relevant, but when you look at university applications, which I'm doing at the moment with my daughter, the grades to get into universities now are kind of A stars, A's across the board. And I do wonder about the children who are never going to get A stars, A's, how demoralising that must be for them when they look at every course they want to do and the grade standards just seem enormous and ridiculous for what the jobs are then going to be. They don't need to be AAA star to get into some of these things. Is there anything we can do to address any of that? Or, I mean, it's probably not in our gift, but it just feels like the children are aiming for an impossible in a lot of the cases.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point to make is there are a variety of pathways for children to go down. You know, university obviously is one of those, but there are lots of other great pathways which can lead to really high skilled employment, even for those that, you know, who are having to look at a level 1 qualification, perhaps post 16. They've got an opportunity to progress, and if they can get on to level 1, level 2, look at an apprenticeship, then there are some fantastic pathways for our students to go on to. So it's about just making sure that they've got the awareness and understanding and knowledge about those pathways, and obviously helping them to succeed on those pathways.
Lovely. Sarah?
I'll just very quickly reference, just in terms of our young people in education, employment and training, we're actually doing very well in the city, and I think there's some really targeted, excellent work being done by members of Mark's service and beyond across the whole partnership. We're also looking at kind of work and work experience for our more vulnerable cohorts, so those with SEND, with the HCP plans, for those care experienced young people in the city. So there are very specific pathways and offers as well within that, but I guess you're right, for that broader population who just narrowly miss, what's that work that we need to do with them and linking in with the colleges?
I think there's a bit of work going on at the university at the moment, because widening participation has become much more to the fore again, and what we're trying to do is a bit of work on making more of our local colleges and schools aware that there are many more contextual offers possible because of the nature of widening participation from students from Portsmouth. And I think it's making parents are absolutely keen this, and others who, because most students, if you look at the data about how they choose their universities, they go and look at the shiny websites, they look at the NSS data, it's friends and family will have the biggest impact on where they will then eventually choose to go. And making them aware that within Portsmouth, we will make contextual offers based upon their educational background is really, really important. And I don't think that's necessarily very widely known at the moment.
I think it is. That's really good. Yep.
I just want to add to the work around apprenticeships and a real push, mainly from a creative industries perspective. So currently what we're doing at Portsmouth Creates is looking at across that sector in particular, which I think is sometimes overlooked in terms of that employability. So what we're doing is we're looking at a mentoring programme for young people and also an apprenticeship scheme to try and get a hold of that cohort of younger people that may have fallen off the traditional education platform as well.
Yeah, no.
I think I'm in your blind spot. I was going to say, in terms of what this tells us as a board, I mean, we are a health and wellbeing board. It doesn't just sit with education. I mean, there's a number of stages before that. So key stage 1, reception, children being ready for school. There's a lot to be picked up by health visitors and in the health sector about obviously speech or the readiness for school, and appreciate that obviously with COVID it's had a problem, and it's probably those 2-year-olds that are now the 4-year-olds that are in reception and coming through. But I guess my challenge is back to the members at the board meeting here really is as a group of multi-agency partners, what are we all doing about it? Because it doesn't just sit with education. It's not just driven by results that we see. There's a lot more that sits behind that. And I think for me, taking that longer term look at what this might be. So those where we've got sort of poorer levels of English and maths coming through the system at key stage 4, well, what are their outcomes? So we talk about the city having low ambition for our young people and low aspiration, and some of it's played out in some of these figures. And then we have challenges about how do we have skills for our employers locally, so they have to bring in those skills because we're not growing them locally, and that will go on generation after generation until we actually really grip this. So albeit COVID's had an impact, and we can clearly see that, some of this has been happening before, and it's how do we as a system, not just education colleagues and people running schools, actually play a really active part in this. It's about, I think, holding up a mirror that we talk about probably every single meeting of the Health and Wellbeing Board. We will talk about the Marmot principles and all of those wider determinants of health, and this is it played out big time, isn't it, in terms of the future of our children and the future of our population. So it's more of a challenge really to put out to the board about, are we really gripping it? Are we really having impact as that multi-agency approach of really unpicking this? I know we've got this £1.8 million that's going in, but that's a drop in the ocean, isn't it? £1.8 million is not really going to turn around the aspirations and outcomes for probably some very vulnerable individuals. Not everybody is vulnerable. There are choices that are possibly being made there. There's other things. I think mental health has also been referred to. But actually, as a system, we need to get better at this to improve those outcomes. So that's probably what I'd want to see from the Health and Wellbeing Board, is sort of coalescing around this and taking ownership.
Yeah, Sarah?
I won't answer or try and answer every point, but yeah, really, really good points to raise, because they're points that we're wrangling with, I guess. So the health visitor piece is an interesting one in terms of the need across the city, in terms of the health visitor resource. We are currently doing a piece of work to really look at what that resource looks like, and actually what do we ask our health visitors to do that absolutely has to be a health visitor, and actually what else could others do to contribute to that in terms of our targeted early help offer. So that's a piece of work we're currently doing, and we'll continue to look at that to check that we've got that response right to our families. The other piece of work that we've got coming up is outside of the Health and Wellbeing Board that will clearly feed back, is we've got 2 meetings planned for December and January, a big conversation, which is about our children's trust, is about our strategies that underpin that trust. But actually the critical piece for this is our education attainment and outcomes, because without those, you're right, we are heading towards some grim stats for our adults, and we have to do better. This all links back into mental health wellbeing for adults in the future. So that will be part of the conversation we have then. We will also be starting a piece of hypothesis work in the coming weeks and into the new year, which is about understanding. We all in the country experienced the pandemic. We all have areas, we have our stat neighbours that have incidents of increased poverty. What is it that's so specific to Portsmouth that is leaving us in the position that we are in currently? And how do we shift that and change that? And what's the ask of everybody in this room? So I think we're leaning towards bringing something larger back in the new year, probably later in the spring, but actually to really tease out some of what is it that is the Portsmouth paradox, not for the reason of the Ofsted High, but why we sit where we do in these tables.
Thank you. I think for me it brings it back to the first presentation we had, and we talked about the cause of the causes, and without a shadow of a doubt, there's a link there. The point you made, which I wholeheartedly agree with regarding the transition from year 6 to 7. As somebody who's got a child who's just done that very transition, it is such a key time. And elsewhere in the country, and I'll use the broader perspective as opposed to just focusing on Portsmouth. When you look at some of the drivers around criminal exploitation and into gangs, it's that period where they're at their most vulnerable because they've got a wraparound in year 6. They then go into that big pond, so to speak, and I'm telling you what you already know. But I'm just bringing it back to, we're talking about how we're going to use strategic needs assessment, strategic assessment, and I think this is so interlinked, and so support from the police is what I'm trying to say. But and also to show how I've always said that what happens in your world massively affects our world, and I think again 6 to 7, without doubt, is a key part of it, as well as all the other elements to it. So.
Yeah, thank you. And again, completely agree with everything that's been said. And just to sort of support how we support that challenge within the wider health and care system around the ICB strategies, around the first 1,000 days, but also around mental health and wellbeing as well. And the opportunity that we've got with Fusion and the creation of the new community mental health provider across Hampshire and the Isle of Wight to really look and learn around how do we get the best outcomes from that service, and how do we use that service, or how do we work with that service differently so it is more engaged in some of these community outcomes. And I think there's a real opportunity there. It's also a threat because it's a change and it's something different, but would really urge the board to make sure that it is driving that agenda with NHS partners and that commissioning for outcomes that will meet the ICB strategic aims. The other bit I think as well that we haven't really grappled with is how do we create as a board and as a group of employers creating different and better outcomes for our young people when they enter the world of work, because the NHS and the City Council and the police, and we're all really big employers, and actually we need to be doing much more to really encourage some of those children to enter our workforce, because we need them, really, because we've got big workforce shortages, and to make that entry level much more accessible. And we've started that, haven't we, with the Health and Care Portsmouth apprenticeship programme that's really successful, but it's a drop in the ocean when you think about it. It's 10 people, and we're struggling with the funding. So I think there's that challenge that you will all need to grapple with as you move forward, really. Thank you.
Thank you. It follows on from actually what Jo said, because there's some, again, I think it is the issue, the paradox is there's some great work happening in Portsmouth, and I would like to say Hayden Gins in Sarah's team is leading the way, not only in Hampshire and Isle of Wight in terms of the work he's doing, but actually is recognised regionally and nationally. But I don't, because that's really good that we are doing this work, and I'm really looking forward to being part of that big conversation. But workforce, as Jo says, is one of the big issues, and Natalie's challenge to us is how we're all working. We've got a provider who has some of the worst, particularly in health visiting and school nurses, numbers. I know it might not want to say it, but the numbers of staff are very, very low. We have got a workforce crisis here as well, and hence why Sarah's point about we have to do it differently. But we also, only because it's one of my headaches, because obviously it's a public health outcomes target, that I speak to the Regional Director of Public Health every month, and every month I get told off because ourselves and Southampton have the worst rates of health visiting, newborn and then the further target visits in the southeast. And that's because, it's not because we don't have a good team, because I do want to say that we have got a workforce crisis, and it's not just in health visiting school nurses. And they are a great team, and we've got incredibly good integrated services here. And again, in Sarah's team, they've done some fantastic work around skills mix. But we've also, because of where we started the conversation, as Mark brought back, our assessment, our strategic assessment, we've also got the worst rates of domestic you know, we've got really bad rates of domestic violence, we've got a lot of poverty. So those health visitors, you know, the big difference is those are the same probably numbers that I'm going to try and use an example that isn't Hampshire maybe, but you know, in rural leafy areas where we've got affluence, less deprivation, they have capacity and time to do all of the nice things. We don't in Portsmouth. Our health visitors are dealing with really, really difficult cases, and that's our problem, isn't it? It is that cycle really. That's part of our issue. So I didn't want to bring it down, but I think we have to work, which is what we're doing, harder and more innovatively to actually make a difference. David?
Just picking up on the challenge, really, I was a question about whether the multi-academy trusts are being challenged enough. And is there something as a board we might want to do collectively to bring to their attention some of the issues that are being tackled with here? And I suppose quite often they can become a bit like the law unto themselves, these trusts, can't they? Quite insular. Do they see the same picture that is being presented here? And is there a greater challenge that the city can present to those trusts?
Francis, come in.
So the positive is that we do have the Education Partnership Board and the trusts are all represented and generally very engaged. And I think that is a real positive, and they've certainly, with the priority education investment area, have understood the needs and bought into the priorities. So that is a real positive. In terms of accountability, accountability is driven through the regional directors from the DFE. But again, Mike and I and Sarah, we all try to maintain that relationship and call on that relationship to maintain that sort of accountability conversation, because it's done on a partnership basis within the sort of Portsmouth area. So there are great positives, but I would say from their health, I've only sort of recently joined here, so linking across to the Education Partnership. But last time we had Scott McKetney come and talk to us and to really highlight to the CEOs of the trust, the head teachers within Portsmouth get together and are well informed, I believe, but to try and get it to that level higher, an invitation stands to bring in sort of somebody to talk about mental health and the offer in Portsmouth, or the police, or any aspect of it that can raise that awareness and therefore join together that offer, because people are very aware. The conversation often comes back to attendance, exclusions, the reasons for it. But I will say that there's a really strong drive in Portsmouth for reducing the number of permanent exclusions, and it is one of the statistics, certainly in this paper, that's lower than nationally and lower than neighbours, which is a real positive. And that is across the whole partnership. So there are pluses and minuses, but generally it's there. But yes, the accountability is where we need to find our answer as well.
And just to add to that, so rest assured there's a lot of challenge coming in from the local authority, so we have an annual conversation with all our multi-academy trusts and go through those results. We're just coming to the end of that exercise at the moment. But as Francis has said, the accountability lies with the regional director, and to be honest, don't know if you'll admit this or not, but there is very little challenge. The only challenge comes in when an academy trust, an academy is judged by Ofsted to be requiring improvement or inadequate. There's a bit of challenge that comes in there. And the regional director tends to look across the trust and all its schools, and of course many of our trusts are national, regional trusts who have 50, 60, 70 plus schools. And if overall the trust is doing well, then they won't tend to look at a particular area. So the challenge is pretty weak from the DFE, which is why we have to work as a collective. And as Francis said, actually, we have got good buy-in. So it's not as if we're starting from a deficit situation. We have got a really strong model here, a really good platform. But,
It has to bear fruit.
has to bear fruit, yeah.
Pitt.
a lot of you will have heard me say this multiple times before, but I'm a massive believer that aspirations is the biggest problem. You go out into these communities in Lamport and Buckland and Portsea, and they don't see beyond the street they live in, and that's the problem. And it's going to keep going on forever and ever and ever unless we start to address that. And that's tough to do, but it is about showing people that there is more to life than just academic results, because these bits of paper are important, but they're not people, they're just statistics. And when you go and talk to these families and these communities, what they tell you is that why should I? What's the point? What's going to be different from me? Now, I come from a family where my dad left school, went straight into the dockyard, got an apprenticeship, stayed in the dockyard until defence cuts in 1982, moved on to other things, but he'd had a career. The opportunities for these kids is not being joined up to the skills that's out there in the way that we need them to be. Because it's not just, employers tell me over and over again, we can train them, we can train pretty much anybody, regardless of how well they've done at school, to do a good job and get a good salary. What we can't do is teach them soft skills. We can't teach them to communicate with people. We can't teach them how to have empathy with other people. And these are the bits that are not statistics, they're about investing and getting out there, and it's time. It's always time. You know, you throw money at these things all day long, it won't make a difference. But you want people into those communities to engage with young people in particular and show them that actually there is always a way to get to something that you would want to do. I used to lecture in music, and you go into a music college and you ask 100 students who wants to be famous, and 100 people will put their hand up. And then you tell them that statistically none of you are going to be famous, so put your hands down. But if you want to keep engaging and having music in your life, there are a whole host of different ways to do that. And it is about, in some ways, being brave enough to say, stuff the statistics, let's address this one child at a time and make sure that they see that in front of them. And I was involved in a programme a few years ago where a school was doing what was ostensibly a great thing and bringing back former students who'd become surgeons or chartered accountants, all these people to talk to the kids. That's a massive disconnect from where they are. Get somebody back who's got a full-time job working in Tesco's and got their own flat and let them talk to the kids. So we do need to make sure that we're actually responding to the communities that we're dealing with and not addressing this, forgive me for saying so, from a middle-class perspective.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? No? Thank you. Now, there was one item that I forgot to mention at the beginning that Andy Biddle had asked us to remind everyone that he'd sent a request on the 15th of November to complete information on what they are doing to make Portsmouth an age-friendly city, and he requires any returns by Friday the 15th of December to the lovely Kelly over here. So, sorry, I meant to mention that at the beginning. Thank you. I think that's everything for today. Thank you everyone for coming. The next meeting is on, I don't know, 6th of March. Oh, that's ages, isn't it? Yeah, 6th of March. We'll look forward to seeing you back then.
Informal session on the 25th of January.
Apparently there's an informal session on the 25th of January, so I will see some of you then. Thank you.